So again, thank you for coming. A couple of things before we begin. First of all, since tonight's theme is about writing and authorship and all, we have been trying to do this project for now 2 or 3 months of getting people to write about their own experiences with COVID. And the reason is, I can't forget my background, and I think about Clinton kids, and 50 years from now, I want our kids locally, rather than read some paragraph out of a history book that probably will be biased anyway, I would like these kids to be able to read something written by me, you, anybody from town. That what was COVID to you? What happened? Did you lose a loved one? How did it affect going to church, going to school, going to work, friendships? Some people were totally unaffected. Others were deeply affected. And so that's what we're looking for. We would like these 4 authors and all of you to do that. You can send it to us through the mail. You can email it to us. We're not editing anything. This is your feelings about life during COVID in Clinton only. How did it go? What happened? And right now we've been pushing this for 3 months, and I think we have maybe 8 or 9 essays on various people. What church was like at St. John's. We have people who wrote about that. We have a great 10-pager from Jean Innamorato, who has a son who lives in China. And so that is a much more global look than my little story on what life was like going on in Clinton as a retiree. So please think about that. There's no time limit. It can be a paragraph. It can be 20 pages. And then get it to us. We put it in a special binder that says, I think, Life in Clinton During COVID. And 50 years from now, it's really going to mean something to the kids of the future, I think. All right, enough said. Tonight, welcome. We have 4 local authors with us. We have Tim Baird.
Hey, everybody.
We have Pat Broderick, Leslie Wilson, and Catherine Parrott. And you probably know at least some of them. We came up with some questions to ask, and then you can ask your own afterwards. And this is not, I'm more used to something like a political show where everybody gets to, 2 minutes and then we shut them off, or you're voting for one. I'm hoping that they all sell every one of their books on their tables tonight, if that's possible. So we'll ask them to be brief, but, then again, we don't want anyone to dominate all the time, but we want to give everybody a chance to talk about what they've written, what they do, and answer some of these questions. So we'll first take this order, and then we'll try to kind of divvy up the order after that. So what we want you to do first, we'll start right here, is just introduce yourself and tell us briefly what your latest book is about.
So again, my name is Tim Baird. I am a writer. I grew up in Clinton. I still work in Clinton over at Nitro, or Jable, depending on how you know it. And my latest book is Goodnight Phobos, Goodnight Deimos, which is a children's bedtime story set on Mars.
So Patrick Broderick wrote under a pen name of Silent Pharaoh, just because, if in case it's terrible, I didn't want anybody to So, yeah, wrote under a pen name, born and raised in Clinton. It's an alternative history or revisionist history book set in 1938 about a little known part of American history called eugenics.
Hi, I'm Leslie Wilson. I'm here to talk about my book, This is the Life, the Diary of Jenny McLeod. And this is basically the transcribed diary of a lady who was born and lived her entire life in Clinton, died in Clinton. She lived much of her life, most of her life, in the house where we now live. And it's an interesting story how I came upon a diary. And for me, this is a special book because during my working life, I wrote 4 books, but they were all work-directed. And this is the first one that's initiated by
Hi, I'm Catherine Perry. I've been in Clinton now about 30 plus years. I live over in the Ridgefield condominiums. And I wrote 11 romances for Harlequin, and this is the latest one. And it's based on the Hallmark Christmas movies. So this is called Christmas at Prescott Inn. That's really my cat on the cover. I always put Ridgefield area pets on my street or in all of my books. And this was based on the movie White Christmas. So we're at an inn in northern New England that's going under. And instead of a troupe of singers that are coming to save the day, we have a troupe of displaced figure skaters. Their cruise ship sank. So they need a place to go for Christmas. And the female lead on the troupe and the male owner of the inn were once engaged and worked together on the cruise ship. So there's a little bit of tension and past history with them. So this was a lot of fun for me to write.
Thank you. All right, Pat, we'll start with you on this one. How did you come up with the idea for either your latest book or a book?
So about 25 years ago, I wrote a book called War Against the Weak by Edwin Black, which was the history of eugenics in this country. And it was one of those moments where I was just like, oh my God, like I can't believe I hadn't learned about it prior to that. Not a lot of people know what eugenics is. So if the other authors would let me, a little bit of an experiment, and it's going to require crowd participation, so please play along. Don't raise your hand until the end. So basically what eugenics is eugenics was this initiative by the government to sterilize people that they didn't think were worthwhile to procreate. So thinking about that, everybody please play along, because otherwise it fails miserably. So if you are from an Irish American background or an Italian background, if you have a history of mental illness in your family, if you've had anyone that's ever been in prison in your family, history of being visually impaired, hearing impaired, epilepsy. Now going back, go all the way back to if you know your grandparents or at least your grandparents, great-grandparents. Yeah, and then so thinking of that, now raise your hand if you fall into any of those categories. So
That's the whole group.
all of us would either not be here because our parents or grandparents were sterilized, or we would be sterilized. So when I read this book, it just totally blew my mind that this was going on. So what I did is it kind of died out, kind of being that it still goes on today in some states. So I kind of took the position of what would have happened if it didn't die out. And that's really where I came up with the idea for it.
Thank you. Leslie.
Well, I pretty much don't feel that I came up with the idea for this book. I feel like this book walked up to me, smacked me in the face and said, write it. We moved to Clinton in 2011, and as part of my working life, I was a curator and a special collections librarian. And one of the things I used to help people do was house research. And so we moved into this nice old Victorian house, and I thought, wow, I'm going to do my own house research now. And so it's not so hard to go online and figure out who lived in your house before you. And then you start taking those names and you put them in Google's search box, and all kinds of interesting stuff comes up. And one of the things that came up was a catalog put out by a Canadian book dealer, M. Benjamin Katz. And he was offering Jenny McLeod's college diary for sale. So the first thing I had to do was figure out, is this the same Jenny McLeod? Because that's not a unique name. And I was able to pull together enough information to figure out that it was. And then I looked at it and I thought, I don't really need to buy this. It's expensive. And so I looked away and I wouldn't allow myself to look for another few weeks, and then I'd go back and I'd look at the listing and it wasn't sold yet, and I'd look away, and I did this for 6 full months before I gave in, and then I realized this thing has got neon lights all over it with my name, so I bought the thing, and then when I got it, I could see that it really had a lot of good social history in it, and that's, that's what I did in my working life. It has women's history, not just Jenny McLeod's biographical, not just her life story, but women's history, social history of Clinton in the early part of the 20th century. It has substance, and so I decided to transcribe the whole thing, annotate it. There's lots and lots and lots of footnotes in there. People who don't like footnotes don't like to necessarily read all that, but when you're talking about a 5-year diary, where you've got 5 years of January 2nd on one page, and 4 lines in which the diarist can write whatever they have to say about January 2nd, 1914, and January 2nd, 1915, it becomes very cryptic. And so it needs sort of almost like translation in a way. Plus it's a different time, 1914 to 1918. Clinton was a different place then, and so there's just a lot of research that was involved. And then I wrote a preface to try and pull it all together and sort of explain the big picture as well as the
Thank you. Okay.
So where do my fiction ideas come from? The problem I have is that I have ideas all the time, and they always are coming at me, and I hear voices in my head. So I have a lot of ideas, and the way that I worked with my editor at Harlequin is that we did 3 or 4 book contracts at a time, and because they were at a time, I would have to develop all the ideas at the time. So I would take weeks of just doing nothing but brainstorming, and I would write up my ideas. We would call them, was it thumbnail prints, I think I called them. And I always wanted to write about things that I was interested in. So for example, one time I had an anesthesiologist heroine. I used to like to write really strong heroines. So my heroines were always going out and doing things, but it was things I wanted to learn about, or things I knew a little bit about and I wanted to learn more. And I used some things that were of interest to me. I mean, I've been figure skating now for 25 years, and I've met a lot of the big people in that world, so I kind of used that for one of my books. So I would write I would write a whole bunch of them. I would send in, say, 20 ideas, and it would be the characters, the setting, the conflict, which is important. And then my editor we would call back and talk about them, and she would offer her suggestions based on the marketing department. Because if you write for one of the big publishers, the marketing is very important, and they would have holes in their schedule of things they wanted more about this. So we would pick out the 4, and then she would give me input on the character development and the plot points and all. So for every contract, I had to write a synopsis of the whole story, the first 3 chapters, which was about 50 pages, and send that in. And then she would bring it up to all the big bosses in the corporation, because there's only something like, of the big publishers, there's only, 4 or 5 companies. I mean, they own Disney, they own all the big TV stations. So she would pitch it to them, and then they would give her the green light, and then I could pop the champagne.
Wow. Jim, how about you? Where do you come up with your ideas?
So my books mainly, the children's book I showed you before is sort of a standalone, but my series that I have, The Dragon and the Whites, is a New England fantasy book, and I'm an avid hiker. My family loves to hike as well. So everything in the book focuses around a New England hiking or camping locale or just somewhere fun to be, except with dragons. Because in all the years I've been hiking, I've never seen a dragon out and about, and I thought I should change that. So it all started basically when I was on a school trip to Iceland, and I was camping on a volcano that was dormant at the time, thankfully. And while I was there, I discovered this cool little cove that I really enjoyed, and it sort of sparked this story in my brain that was just a couple-page story at that point. And I had never written a book. I'm a mechanical engineer by day. I did very well in English, at least I thought I did, but never decided to do anything about it. But once I had this idea in my head about this world that I could create, it sort of just took off from there. So there's now 3 books in this series, and I have short stories that I'm writing to go along with it. So my ideas has kind of come from every time I go hiking, I go see a cool cave, a cool mountain, a neat forest. I can sort of just imagine something that could happen there, and that's where my creativity kind of takes forward. So.
Very good. All right, Leslie, we'll start with you on this one. Talk a little bit about the writing process. In other words, do you have a set routine? Do you just write when you feel like writing? Do you go into like a lockdown and write? How's that happen?
Well, since I started writing books during my working life, there's a certain discipline that's imposed from the outside on that. With this book, once I had the idea, there was all kinds of momentum. I didn't really need to worry about developing discipline to get the book written. And I happen to be a person who gets up at 4:30 in the morning. All of my energy is in the morning, and so if I can just get stuff down on paper in the early morning hours until maybe about 12 or 1 o'clock, it's a done deal.
Well, I had to write these books to deadline, so I had a certain date it was due. So engineering me figured out how many words I needed per day and what I needed to do. And then my process would be I had to be enthusiastic and ready to go. So I would kind of meditate a little and take the critic and put the critic aside, take the ego, put the ego aside. You just want to hear the voices in your head, channel it through you, listen, get it on paper. You want to get the words on the paper. And that's how I do it. On a good day, you get in the flow, and hours can go by and you don't even know it.
Wow.
And that's the whole joy of writing. If you can get to the flow. To me.
All right, where am I here? Tim.
So I write in the complete opposite way. So this is not my day job, and I have a 5-year-old at home. So typically, we're busy. If I try to write more than 4,000 or 5,000 words in a day, I can't. Like, I'll just kind of freak out. But I'm most comfortable doing 500 words here, 500 words there. And half the time, I just keep it open on my computer throughout the day. And if I'm eating lunch at work, I'll just crank out another paragraph or 2. Hit save, close it. I'll do another one before I go to bed. So I've written, I wrote the 2nd book in my series in 7 months. I wrote my 1st book in 4 years. So you can see there's not really a consistent schedule that I stick to. Because the way I see it is if I start stressing over it too much, I'm not going to have fun and I'm not going to want to keep doing it. If I do it in a relaxed way, I feel like I'm more comfortable, I can let my creativity flow a little more, and it's going to take me a lot longer than maybe I want to, but I'm going to be happier with the product in the end. The irony is I would love to write as a job, and then I will have to switch to Catherine's schedule, and then I'll have to change my brain a little bit, so we'll see how that works. Yeah.
Pat, how about you?
So generally, what I do is I start with crippling amounts of self-doubt. I add in a little bit of self-loathing. And when I'm a completely gutted shell of a human being, then I start to write. I wish I was kidding. That's really kind of how it is. The big thing for me is I had to have some kind of accountability. I used to be a reporter, so I always had that deadline to hit, which was nice. So I joined a writer's group, and you could submit as much as you wanted, but you had to submit at least once every 2 months. So I had that accountability where I had to have something new to submit. And it was kind of brutal, I mean, there was times when I didn't want to write at all. And I have to know the end of the story before I can start writing. I'm trying to do one now And I started writing, and I've got like 8 chapters, but I have no idea where it's going to go or how it's going to end, and I just feel like I'm flailing around. So to me, the biggest thing was the accountability.
Well, all right, Catherine, we'll start with you on this one. As a child, did you know you wanted to do this? Did you do a lot of reading or a lot of writing as a child that kind of showed this is the way you were going to go?
It was my favorite thing to do, yeah. Yeah, I can't remember when I didn't write.
That's one.
But I was a big fan. You remember the Nancy Drew series of
Sure,
books?
yes.
I was a huge fan. I wanted to be Caroline Keene when I grew up. But Caroline Keene is not a real person. I didn't realize that. It was about 100 different people that wrote as Caroline Keene. I thought she had the best job in the world because she got to travel, to go to all these cool places that Nancy Drew went to, and then write about it.
Wow. Kim, what about you?
No, not at all. I've always been an avid reader, but writing was always something that I kind of loathed because I had to do it in school, and I didn't like doing an assignment if I didn't like the book or I didn't like the story writing prompt. But whenever we had free writing prompts, I felt that I did very well because I could just creatively do whatever I wanted.
Yeah.
So I never saw it as a job, never saw it as something I was going to do. Went to school, went to WPI Worcester for mechanical engineering. It's what I've always done. But then I decided to just start writing for fun on the side, and that's where it's kind of taken off from there.
Pat, how about you?
Always been an avid reader. Used to do the MS readathons when I was in elementary school. As far as writing, no, it wasn't anything I even thought of. I think the first thing I ever wrote that kind of gave me the writing bug was I wrote a letter to the editor for the Times and Courier, and I actually got a job and was reporting there. And it was they ran it as a guest column, and it was politically. It was a political column, and then the next week I got 2 letters. One was like, "Oh my God, this is the most amazing thing! Everybody needs to read it." And the other was, "Who the hell does Patrick Broderick-Linky is?" I thought to myself, I can get paid to do this. So I started doing that, and then as far as the novel goes, I got into a really bad spot with a job, like a really toxic work environment. And it was in the middle of that huge recession. I'm like, oh my God, there's no way out of this. And the only thing I could think of that would let me get out of this situation was writing. So that's when I started.
Wow.
This is quite a story. And certainly I read a lot when I was a kid. I can remember reading one of the Little House books every weekend. And I had a dark period when I went through Edgar Allan Poe when I was an adolescent. I seem to remember loving anything history or historical fiction about ancient Egypt. As far as writing goes, I didn't write in particular except for school. And actually school was the reason that I learned to like writing, because when you write for a social studies project or a history project, your teacher is an audience, and sometimes the audience validates, and I sort of made that connection. And the more you write, the better you get at it, the better the validation is. And so teachers can do good things sometimes.
Sometimes they don't. All right, thank you. We're back to Tim. How about, was there one defining moment that kind of made you decide to start writing to begin with? Some magic moment, something that happened to you, something that said, I got to get writing this down. I have to write.
So the first probably year and a half I spent writing The Dragon and the Whites. It was basically just an ongoing Google Doc that I had, and I was literally just putting down a couple pages every month or so. It wasn't really a thing. And then my wife and I got married, and we started talking about having a child. And I was like, I want to give a gift to my son. I want to give him his own story that he can read someday where he's the protagonist. And so when my wife was pregnant is when I really sort of like shifted into a higher gear, and I changed the protagonist of the story to a fictionalized version of what I foresaw as my son. Like, he's only 5 right now, and he's 25, 30 in the book. So So you can see I sort of took some creative liberties with what he's going to do with the rest of his life. And that was my goal. It's originally just going to have it be basically a PDF that I was just going to print out and give to him one day. And it was just going to be a gift, you know, when he was like 10 or 12 or something. Be like, here you go, buddy. Here's a story where you're the main character. And then I fleshed it out. I found out about Amazon Kindle Direct Publishing and decided to actually make it a book. And I had so much fun writing the first one that I just kept barreling through and started book 2. So that's sort of how I started writing and really made it serious.
Good. Pat, how about you? One defining moment.
One defining moment. As far as the book goes, when I left the paper, it was pretty tough because I did really enjoy that. So I liked being out in the town and writing about stuff. I liked that creative process, and I think I underestimated how much I would miss it when I did leave. So I joined the writing group, and then so when I started writing and submitting, people really liked it, which was odd to me, because usually when I was at the paper, it was like 50-50 right down the middle. Like, some people hated it, some people loved it, and it seemed to get really good reviews, and people were excited, and they kept wanting to see what happened. So I think that really kind of helped keep it going.
Yeah. Leslie?
I think it was cumulative for me. It sort of just built over time. If there's anything like a defining moment, there was a period of maybe 2 or 3 years when I wrote columns for the Concord Journal on all different topics related to Concord history. And again, it's that audience thing, the feedback thing. People would come to me and say, I loved that story. And after a certain point, I realized that I needed to collect those essays and make them into a book. And, you know, that was well received. And so, you know, it just built over time.
Catherine?
So yes, I did have a lightning bolt moment. When I was young, I would only write short pieces, like in a journal, or poems, or short stories, and I always thought a novel was too hard. And then one day I was at work, and it was in the early 80s, and I was a young engineer, and we were in a factory, because I was an industrial engineer, and we were putting in a mainframe computer where they had never had computers. It was back in the days when everything was on paper. And they came in, and of course, back in the early 80s, I was the only female in this place too. But they came in, you know, to their credit, they came in with the brand new thing that no one had ever seen. And it was a PC, only it was not the PCs we know. It looked like a compact sewing machine. And they said, we're looking for a volunteer to write the user manual. And of course, everyone looked at me because I was the female. But I said, because all I could think was, it's a word processor. So I said, well, I'll do it if I can take it home. And they said, yes. So I took it home and I wrote a novel. And it was awesome because I hated typewriters. You would run out of the ribbon would go bad, and you would be in the middle of the paper and the ribbon, you wouldn't have ribbons. It was awful. But with this new thing called the word processor, you could type a page, because I'm a puzzle writer. I just type and then I rearrange. And you could cut and paste, and I thought, this is amazing. It was so easy, so much easier than it used to be. So that was my light bulb moment when I wrote my first novel. I couldn't tell you what the novel was about, obviously. It was just the whole process of it.
All right, thank you. Pat, we'll start with you. How about what mistakes did you make along the way in writing in general?
How much time do we have? I've made 6 while I've been on the stage. I mean, it's a complete learning process, the whole thing. Self-publishing, it was not something I was familiar with, so I'm learning as I go, you know, from, you know, how to even just deal with the publishing company, because it's so complicated for them as far as, well, we're going to put it on Amazon, but you don't get the money if it sells on Amazon until Amazon claims it from us. So you can sell books in January and you're not getting paid until April. So you have no idea, and that really kind of threw me off. I'm like, but you're shipping it to Amazon, so why wouldn't? But yeah, I mean, I'm terrible at computers, absolutely terrible at computers. So the first draft that I sent out had a bunch of typos in it because I uploaded the wrong document to the publishing company. So, I mean, it was just, yeah, a nightmare.
Leslie, how about you? Mistakes along the way?
Well, I think the biggest one, it was a youthful mistake. Early on, I think everybody is a little bit reluctant to recognize that every piece of writing, no matter how good it is and no matter how good the writer, requires editing and rewriting and editing and rewriting. And I can recall a time when, you know, you're so delighted with your best effort that you're sort of blind to that. And that's something that comes with time, you know, being able to step back from it, being objective. It's almost like being a third party, you know, looking at it. So.
Wow. Catherine, how about you?
I think I've made every mistake you possibly can. Every day I make mistakes. I do everything, I do things wrong all the time. And you just keep going. You just keep going on the journey. Some things you learn from, everything you just dust yourself off. I can't even pick it every day. I screw something up every day, especially with computers, dealing with all the little things you have to do as a self-published person. It's all on you. You are every little tiny thing you're in charge of. And I'm constantly getting emails from Kindle telling me things are screwed up. And you deal with it, you try again.
Tim, how about you?
My biggest mistake, I'd say, was on my first book. I didn't involve any beta readers. Only my wife and my editor read the book before I published it. And what I found was there were a bunch of kind of story issues where things didn't flow the way they should have, and some things were overdefined, some things were underdefined. And at the time, my editor was only doing line edits and wasn't really doing anything for the story, and my wife was being an amazingly supportive wife for a husband writing his first book, and wasn't as critical as she has been on my later books, which is a good thing. So every book I've written after my first book, I've involved at least probably 10 people to read the book before it ever sees the light of day. And you need that real world feedback. You need somebody to tell you that this stinks, like this part is dumb, this part shouldn't be here, this is too long. And you need that real feedback. So if you're only involving people who love you and are afraid to hurt your feelings, you're not going to get the right feedback. And the feedback you're ultimately going to get, you're going to find on Amazon reviews when like a 1-star pops up and somebody tells you it sucks. So if you're writing any kind of story, I highly advise you to reach out to some friends, family members, and have them read it and give you feedback.
Wow. Thank you. All right, Leslie, how much of your own life experiences are in your book or your characters? Is there any part of you in a character you've written about?
Well, since I only write nonfiction, yeah, I think the answer is pretty much no in a big way. But I think in terms of my choice of subjects, I mean, that's where I come into the picture. I mean, I'm very interested in the story of women's lives, women's history, partly because good documentation of women's lives is a whole lot scarcer than it is for men. And so, you know, that's my natural interest, and that's why I so enjoyed working on Jenny McLeod. And even when I was working at Concord, and I didn't have full agency over the subjects that I chose, when I could, I gravitated towards women's subjects. Yeah.
Catherine, how about you?
I think yes, naturally. I think writing fiction pieces of yourself slip into it. I think sometimes in big ways. I mean, I've been hearing impaired since I was a little girl, and one of my heroines was hearing impaired. I wrote about being a female engineer, one of my heroines. Yeah.
Kim, how about you?
So my first series, The Dragon and the Whites, is basically a gift to my family and friends. So my son is the protagonist, His dad in the story is Jim, which is a real big switch, up from his real dad, so you can see what I did there. And in Eggs in Two Baskets, my wife is the protagonist in that story. So my self-published books, I've tried to basically give nods to my friends and family for supporting me. So if you are one of my real good friends, there's a chance that I had a dragon kill you in my story. That's how I give back to my community.
Nice of you.
Whereas the story I'm writing right now, it's going to be my first book that I'm actually going to query out to agents to try to get published traditionally. So there's nothing personal going into it, so that if somebody wants to hack and slash characters and add things in that I don't like, I won't take it personal because it's not going to affect anybody that I know and love.
Matt, how about you?
99.9% of everything in my book is something that's pulled from my experiences. I'm constantly cataloging stuff in my brain. Like if I come up with somebody has an interesting quirk, or they have, a turn of a phrase that somebody does, or somebody will tell me a story. And a lot of the people that I put in it and the characters were named. I named them after people in town that I grew up with. So folks from town probably know Spooks Mahan. Spooks Mahan is he's a boxing trainer in the book. St. John's Church, I used to paint houses with Tommy Mortimer, and we were painting St. John's Church when they were restoring all the beautiful paintings in there. And I talked to one of the artists, and he had a really interesting fact, which I was like, oh, that would be good. I could put that into the novel, because, just a little sidebar, that has nothing to do with it being in the story, but all those paintings down in the church, they all have one thing wrong with them. So that was, artists back then couldn't sign their names, so instead of doing that, what they would do is they would give baby Jesus 2 left feet, or one would be missing an ear. So I thought that would be kind of interesting to tie in with the whole eugenics aspect of the story. So, Bigelow Mills, it's in there. Tom Brady, who used to own the junk store down on High Street, without a doubt the greatest storyteller I've ever had the fortune of sitting down with. I changed his name because I wasn't sure if he'd be cool with me putting it in there, but the old painter in the church is based on Tom Brady. So I know John Steinbeck, when he was writing The Grapes of Wrath, the story goes, I don't know if it's true or not, but he went up to a group of Okies sitting around the campfire and offered them $1 to whoever told him the best story. The one who won became the end of The Grapes of Wrath, so I didn't feel so bad. It's good enough for Steinbeck. It's so
Very good. Catherine, is there a writer that you looked up to or has inspired you, a favorite author or a favorite book?
Oh my gosh. I can't pick just one. Like I said, when I was a little girl, it was reading the Nancy Drew books that inspired me to start writing books, so I'll go with that.
And then you found out it was mass produced.
It took 100 people to do it.
Tim, how about you?
Mine is probably John Scalzi. He's a newer science fiction writer, but I read his first big novel, to me at least, was Old Man's War. And most science fiction that I read is very serious, very straightforward. They try to keep the math and the science right, and it's more uptight feeling. His writing is very snarky. There's lots of jokes. There's the occasional swear, and it's more lighthearted while still telling a good story. And that's who I feel my style kind of gravitates towards, where I want to tell a good tale, but I also want to put in my own funny dad joke humor and kind of keep it lighthearted in the process. So that's kind of what I look up to when I write.
Very good. Pat, how about you?
Steinbeck is probably the biggest one. I can't tell you the effect Grapes of Wrath had on me. In Dubious Battle, Cormac McCarthy was fantastic. Really dark, which is kind of my wheelhouse, much to my mother's chagrin. Yes, Cormac McCarthy. Hunter Thompson is fantastic. Shirley Jackson, Flannery O'Connor. I mean, there's really way too many for me to list. What I find is when I write, then I can actually go through each chapter in my book and I can tell you what book I was reading when I was writing it. Because I find that I pick up, like, not that I'm copying their style or anything, but I fall into kind of their rhythm. So there's Steinbeck chapters, there's Cormac McCarthy chapters, there's Stephen King chapters, like just the whole gamut.
Wow. Leslie, how about you?
Well, for fiction, I like a whole lot of different writers, too many to really go into in a meaningful way. For nonfiction, I'm a big fan of a current writer, Megan Marshall, who's written 3 major biographies, women's biographies. She wrote The Peabody Sisters in 2005, that was published. She wrote Margaret Fuller, A New American Life, in 2013, and that won the Pulitzer Prize for biography in 2014. And then she wrote a biography of Elizabeth Bishop, who was one of her teachers when she was in college. And I really like her because A, she focuses on women, and B, she's a very generous person with all kinds of writers. She's a teacher, and so she has a good ability to deal kindly with lesser writers. But she's also just an excellent writer.
All right, Tim, we're back to you. Tell us about the process you followed in finding a publisher. I'm not sure if you 3 of you self-published, I think. Well, you did too, but you also did the other one. But how do you go about doing that? I think anybody who wants to write a book has no idea what to do once the book is ready to roll or whatever.
So what I did when I first was probably like 3/4 of the way down with the book and realized that I was actually going to publish a book, I started looking at all the publishing houses of the books that I like to read. So I looked at Tor primarily because they do a lot of science fiction, and I kept looking at all these different publishing houses that I feel I want my work to be published by, and they were all closed to like personally submitted requests. And they were only taking agent submissions. And I knew I was a nobody, I was an engineer, nobody knew me as a writer, so I wasn't gonna just go out there and have this awesome debut novel. I knew this, you know? So I started researching into self-publishing, and I ended up going with Amazon Direct because it was the most user-friendly looking one that I found at the time for somebody who had never published a book. After doing a couple books, I now publish this one through Ingram Spark, just so it's more directly put out there into the distribution world. So when I did Amazon Kindle, you have to do a ton of work to really get your book out there, especially if you want to have it go beyond Amazon website. But when you do it with Ingram Spark, it just automatically gets pushed out to every single bookstore that works through Ingram, which is one of the biggest distributors out there. So if somebody's looking for advice, I say if you want to do traditional, start clearing and write the best letter you can and cross your fingers and send 100 different replies and hope for the best. If you want to do self-publishing, I recommend Ingram Spark.
Pat, how about you?
So I published with BookBaby. Tim doesn't know this, but he was actually one of the reasons that I self-published, so you probably don't remember, but you were at the event.
Oh, at the library in the basement?
Yeah. And you were talking about, I asked you why you went self-publishing, and your response was basically, well, I kind of wanted to have control of it myself. You know, yeah, I had these dreams. I mean, to be honest, I had these dreams that you'd be talking to a Pulitzer Prize winner right now, but clearly that didn't work out as planned. And I have a very low level, or a very low tolerance for tedium. So the idea of like constantly bombarding publishers or editors or agents, and you know, formatting emails and things, I just didn't have the stomach for it. And I wanted to have control over it. You know, it was such a personal thing to me. In all honesty, this is probably my opus. I don't know if I have another book in me. You know, so I didn't want somebody coming in at the end and saying, well, no, you got to change the ending, because to me, it's all very carefully constructed to fit together. So yeah, to me it was, and then the other thing, you hear these, stories like J.K. Rowling, she had to submit it 100 times before she got chosen. It took me 20 years of thinking about writing the book, 5 years of writing it, and now I'm going to spend another 5 years trying to find a publisher. I'd rather just put it out on my own, and now I have control. At the same time, I don't have anybody helping me promote it, so that's kind of the balance, the counterbalance.
Leslie, how about you?
Well, this book was published through a hybrid publisher called Moonglade Press. Hybrid publishers, they're basically a vehicle for self-publishing, but they're a little more curated than publishing it entirely yourself. They don't publish necessarily everything that comes their way. They will decide whether or not they want to publish it. And initially, I had done some research. I talked with somebody who advises authors, and he read the manuscript and he said, well, this could be published by a trade publisher. But I thought, my one experience with publishing through a trade publisher, I probably shouldn't confess this, but I did do a Cliff's Notes a number of years ago. I'm probably the only Clinton author of a Cliff's Notes. And it was something they were trying. They came after me, and they were trying a longer format, and it wasn't about one author or one work. It was about Thoreau, Emerson, and Transcendentalism, which is like, it was a 250-page Cliff's Notes. So, but for that, they basically controlled the structure of it, and it wasn't fully my product. And I really control, as you say, you both say, was important to me. I wanted to write the book and publish the book that I wanted to write and publish. And then the other thing is, the time factor as well. I am 67, and time is of the essence at this point. I didn't feel like shopping this around for 5 years and being lucky in the end.
Catherine, so you've had both experiences.
Yes. Is anyone in the audience writing books and hoping? No? Okay. Back when I got the idea in my head to have a goal that I wanted to be traditionally published, there was no self-publishing. It didn't exist. And there was a thing called vanity publishing, where you could have your book done and you would pay money to them, and then they would ship you thousands of copies that sat in your garage, and then you had to go out and sell it. People did it, and supposedly I think that's how John Grisham started, wasn't it? He sold books out of his trunk. So that was a little daunting to me, and I didn't have that much money. So what I did was, I knew I was writing romance. I joined a nationwide writer group for my genre, and I became a super member, super volunteer. I served on the board of directors of the local thing. I ran conferences. I did every volunteer thing you could. I went to every workshop, and top best-selling authors would give you workshops on how to structure your novel and how to develop characters. I went to everything I could. I took every class I could. And once a year I went to the national conference, and every agent and editor in the entire industry was there. I hung out at the bar. I talked to people. I networked with people. I learned how to pitch stories. I went to every workshop. I bought the tapes. I would go home all year and listen to tapes. And eventually, if you do this long enough, they either get sick of you or they get to know you. And then your friends that you come up with, they start to get published. So then they start getting invited to the publishing parties, and then you hitch along and go with them. So eventually, when it was right, and it took me a lot of novels to really learn to understand how to write a good story. It wasn't something to me that in the beginning was something I was this great genius at. I had to learn how to do it. And after all those years, and the time was just right, and when I was ready to sell, it sold. And it was with an editor that I had known for a few years, that had known me. And the process that they go through, or at least Harlequin goes through, is you submit a book and you get back this like 20-page, they call it a revision letter, and they really put you through your paces. I learned so much. I learned a lot, and I really enjoyed learning a lot. There came a point, though, in the last few years where self-publishing is is really viable, and I really wanted to do it, and I've been taking a lot of classes along the way, and I'm really thrilled that I was getting back rights to my books, and I was able to put them up myself. I had to do a new cover and a new back cover blurb, but like Tim, I go through Ingram, so my mom can go to her little bookstore in Newburyport and give them my ISBN number, and then 2 days later they call her and the book's in and she can bring it home and have my book. Whereas with the Harlequins, they only did a short print run, so however many print run they did, when it was out, it was done. They didn't reprint it. With these, they never go out of print. So. And you do have control, which is really wonderful. Sometimes there were copy editors that I didn't particularly like. You have the control over, you get to hire your own copy editor or have your own people work on it. So I do both.
All right. Thank you. All right, last question. We start with Pat Stern. What advice would you give to people who are just starting to write or have always wanted to write a book?
Don't do it.
Why are you here tonight?
I kind of did feel that way for a long time, but because I have to constantly remind myself, and usually it's not me, it's other people who remind me, the sense of accomplishment of actually typing the end and actually seeing it is so rewarding, and I kind of lost track of that. And so, but there's always people that come up and be like, oh my God, you wrote a novel. Like, do you realize that's a pretty big deal? So I would suggest doing it, in all seriousness, stick with it. Find something that you're passionate about, because I think that's really, really the big thing. Because that's going to come out in your writing. If you do decide to go with self-publishing, really educate yourself on it, as far as everything from cover design to, they don't, at least Bookbaby doesn't offer editing services, so, there's just a lot that you have to go through and you have to learn. So do your due diligence, and I think the biggest thing is finding something you're passionate about.
And I agree with that. Certainly for nonfiction, when you're going to end up having to do research for a couple of years or maybe more, you want to pick a subject that you can live with for a long time and really throw yourself into it. The other thing, this sounds a little bit school teacher-y, but allow, when you're doing research toward having a final product like a book in the end, you really want to let the research, what you discover, inform what you write, rather than doing what so many people seem to do these days, which is to formulate a thesis and then go look for the stuff that's going to prove their thesis. That's not research, that's not real. And so, I saw that over and over again during my working life, and it doesn't make for a good book. You want to be honest and really have the story right.
Yes.
I don't know, I think if you want to write, don't tell anyone, don't ask permission from anyone, just sit and do it, and don't worry about it. You learn what you need to go as you go along. So don't try, as best you can, try not to have anxiety, because things happen when they're supposed to happen.
Tim?
So I'm going to piggyback off what she was saying. If you overthink it, it's going to be too tough. What I recommend is don't try to write a novel, don't try to write a short story, try to just write your ideas. So when I start a story, what I do is I typically write 10 bullet points. Might be a full sentence, might be a couple words about what's going to happen in my idea of the story. Then each bullet point becomes a couple sentences. Then they become a paragraph, then they become a page. And next thing you know, I've got like 5 or 6 pages built out with just a couple quick bullet points. And then I can very quickly figure out if the story is going to go somewhere or not. And sometimes it just put it off to the side and forget you ever saw it. And then sometimes it becomes a couple books sitting on a table at the Holder Memorial. So if you want to write, don't sit down one day and just think like, oh man, I'm writing a novel. Just start piecemealing it and start just putting your ideas to paper Because if you try to write a novel, you're going to stress out and you're never going to do it. If you just try to write a couple pages, you're going to write a couple pages, and then that might become a couple paragraphs, a couple chapters, so that might become a couple books. So that's the biggest thing I would say is don't aim for that end goal. Enjoy the process.